It was not a screaming match in the driveway that ended my 40 years of marriage. It was a simple, quiet question asked across a polished mahogany table on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was 62 years old, serving as the Director of Technology Architecture at a prominent mid-sized logistics firm in Atlanta. My husband, John, was the Director of Human Resources at the very same company. We were, to the outside world, the pinnacle of Black excellence in the corporate sphere. We had the sprawling brick home in the suburbs, the 2 college-educated children, the matching 401k portfolios, and a marriage that had weathered 4 decades of life's shifting seasons. But a marriage is rarely what it appears to be from the curb. From the outside, you see the fresh paint and the manicured lawn. You don't see the termite damage in the foundation. You don't see the structural beams bowing under the weight of decades of unspoken resentments, silent compromises, and the slow, methodical erasure of a woman's voice. On that particular Tuesday, I was sitting in the quarterly executive review. The boardroom was frigid, the air conditioning humming aggressively as it always did on the top floor. I was exhausted, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with my age, and everything to do with the fact that I had spent the last 3 weeks commuting to my 6-figure job in the back of cheap rideshare sedans. Sarah, our chief executive officer, sat at the head of the table. Sarah was a sharp, observant woman in her late 50s who missed absolutely nothing. She had spent the last hour reviewing the operational budget, flipping through pages of data with a silver pen in her hand. My crowning achievement for the quarter had been leading a massive legacy data migration initiative, a project we had internally dubbed the Fated Ledger because it involved dragging decades of old, buried company records into a new, transparent digital architecture. I was proud of that project. It was precise. It was honest. Sarah closed her leather portfolio. She looked around the table, the silver pen tapping rhythmically against the mahogany, before her eyes settled on me. "Sophia," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. "Can I ask you an administrative question?" I sat up straight, ignoring the dull, familiar throb of arthritis in my lower back. "Of course, Sarah." "Fleet management sent over the quarterly audit this morning," Sarah began, her tone casual but her eyes incredibly focused. "They noted that your company lease, the Mercedes we issued for your directorship promotion, hasn't been scanned at the security gate in 3 weeks. In fact, I saw you arriving in a rideshare this morning. Is the vehicle in the shop? Because if it is, the company should be providing you with a corporate loaner." The air in the room seemed to evaporate. I could feel a sudden intense heat rising in my neck, flushing my cheeks. 2 chairs down from me, I felt John's posture instantly stiffen. The Mercedes wasn't just a car to me. It was a physical manifestation of everything I had fought for. I had started at this company in 1986 in the typing pool. I was a young Black woman in the Deep South with an associate degree and a mountain of ambition. I had worked 80-hour weeks, gone to night school to get my engineering degrees, and battled through layers of invisible ceilings. When I was finally handed the keys to that midnight blue executive sedan, I had sat in the driver's seat and wept. It meant I had arrived. But for the past 3 weeks, that car had been gone. Before I could form a word to answer Sarah, before I could invent a plausible lie about engine trouble or recall notices to protect my husband's pride, John leaned forward. He rested his elbows on the table and put on his best, most benevolent smile, the smile he used when he was managing a difficult employee. "Sarah, Sophia actually insisted my younger sister use it for a while," John said, his voice smooth as glass, chuckling slightly as if sharing a light-hearted anecdote with the room. "You know Sophia. She'd give you the shirt off her back. Beatrice has been having some transmission trouble with her old sedan and had a string of job interviews lined up. Sophia just couldn't bear to see her struggle, so she handed over the keys." He didn't look at me. He just sat there, confidently rewriting reality, fully expecting me to play along. He expected me to nod, to smile with graceful humility, to absorb the blame for mismanaging a highly expensive corporate asset, all to protect the image of the great, generous Hanks family. To understand why he felt so confident doing this, you have to understand the morning, 3 weeks prior, when my car was taken. It was a Monday. I had woken up at 5:30 a.m., slipping out of our custom California king bed without making a sound so I wouldn't disturb John's sleep. The house was enormous, beautiful, and completely silent now that our children, Michael and Chloe, were grown and gone. I walked down the curved mahogany staircase to the kitchen. John had a massive imported espresso machine sitting on the granite counter, a gift he had bought for the house last Christmas. I didn't know how to use it. The one time I had tried, he had hovered over my shoulder, clicking his tongue and sighing heavily, until he finally took the frother out of my hand, saying, "Sophia, let me just do it. You lack the delicate touch for this machinery. You're going to break it." I never touched it again. Instead, I made myself a cup of cheap instant coffee every morning, stirring it with a metal spoon while staring out the bay window. That morning, as I sipped my bitter coffee, I looked out at the driveway. My designated parking spot, where the Mercedes usually sat gleaming under the security lights, was empty. "John!" I had called out as he walked into the kitchen, adjusting his silk tie and smelling of expensive sandalwood cologne. "Where's my car? Did you move it?" He didn't look up from his phone. "Beatrice came by late last night and picked it up. Her transmission is completely shot. I told her she could borrow the Mercedes for a few weeks until she gets back on her feet." I remember freezing, the coffee cup trembling slightly in my hand. "John, you didn't even ask me. You didn't wake me up. That car is registered under my name through the corporate executive lease program. I am legally and financially liable for it. Beatrice isn't on the company insurance policy." John stopped adjusting his tie. He placed his phone face down on the granite counter and turned to me. His dark eyes hardened, and his posture shifted into that overbearing, patriarchal stance he had perfected over 40 years. "You know, Sophia," he said, his voice dropping into a register of deep, manufactured disappointment. "My mother warned me about this before we got married. She said that once you started climbing the corporate ladder, you'd lose your sense of community. You'd forget about family." "This isn't about forgetting family, John. This is about a corporate asset." "My sister is struggling," he interrupted, his voice rising, effectively drowning me out. "We are deeply blessed. We have a 6-bedroom house. You make a 6-figure salary. We have stock portfolios. And yet you are standing here harassing me over a piece of metal while my own flesh and blood can't even get to a job interview. Do you really want to be the kind of bitter, selfish woman who hoards her blessings? Is that the legacy you want to leave your children?" There it was, the trap I had stepped into 1,000 times before. If I said no, I was the angry, ungrateful, materialistic wife who lacked Christian charity. I was the stereotype his mother always claimed I would become. If I said yes, I was surrendering another piece of my autonomy, another piece of the respect I had earned. For 40 years, I had been the shock absorber for John's ego. I had cooked the Thanksgiving turkeys for 20 people while working 50-hour weeks. I had balanced the household checkbooks because he couldn't be bothered with the minutiae. I had smiled politely when his family made passive-aggressive comments about my hair, my cooking, or my ambition. I had made myself the invisible, uncomplaining foundation so he could stand tall and play the role of the grand provider. I was so tired of fighting. I was so tired of being told that having boundaries meant I was difficult. So I swallowed the heavy lump in my throat. I looked down at my instant coffee. "Fine," I whispered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "Just for her interviews. Tell her she needs to be incredibly careful. It's a leased vehicle." John's face instantly softened into a victorious, self-satisfied smirk. "That's my good wife," he said, stepping forward to press a kiss to my forehead. "I knew you'd understand. You just have to look at the bigger picture." He picked up his keys and walked out the door to drive his own pristine Lexus to the office, leaving me to figure out how I was going to get to work. 2 days turned into a week stretched into 2, then 3. Every time I asked John when Beatrice was returning the car, he had a new, increasingly vague excuse. The mechanic was waiting on a part. Her interviews got pushed back. She needed to run some errands for the church. And every time I pushed back, his tone grew uglier, shifting from patronizing to outright hostile. "I cannot believe you are still badgering me about this," he snapped one evening during dinner, slamming his fork down on the table hard enough to chip the china. "Take an Uber, Sophia. Stop trying to play the victim. You are making this house a miserable place to be." So I took Ubers. I, the director of technology architecture, stood on the curb of our suburban development every morning at 6:45 a.m., waiting for a stranger to pick me up. It wasn't just the $20 disappearing from my checking account every morning and evening. It was the slow, daily erosion of my dignity. I had always prided myself on my immaculate professionalism. I believed that as an older black woman in corporate America, I had to be flawless just to be considered competent. But without my car, my routine was shattered. Drivers would get lost trying to navigate our gated community. I would sit in the back of vehicles that smelled of stale cigarette smoke or overly sweet vanilla air fresheners, anxiously watching the clock tick past 8 a.m. I would rush into the corporate lobby at 8:15 a.m., flustered, my hair frizzy from the humid Atlanta mornings, carrying my heavy laptop bag because my shoulder ached and I couldn't leave it securely in a trunk. My team noticed the change. They noticed the way I hurried through the hallways, apologizing for being late to morning stand-ups. They noticed that my usually immaculate composure was fraying at the edges. No one noticed more than Jasmine. Jasmine was a 28-year-old junior architect in my department. She was brilliant, driven, and reminded me so much of myself at her age. She was navigating a corporate world that, despite all its modern diversity seminars, was still largely a boys' club. I had taken her under my wing, determined to help her avoid the landmines I had stepped on. On a Friday afternoon during the third week of the car ordeal, I was sitting in the employee break room, massaging my aching knees after a particularly jerky taxi ride. Jasmine walked in to get a bottle of water. She stopped, looking at me with a quiet, observant concern. "Ms. Sophia, are you okay?" she asked softly, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. "I don't mean to pry, but your parking spot has been empty all month. You've been coming in via rideshare, and you look tired. Is everything all right at home?" I pasted on the matriarchal smile I had perfected over decades. The smile that said, "I have everything under control. Do not worry your pretty head." "Everything is perfectly fine, Jasmine," I lied smoothly. "Just some routine maintenance on the vehicle. You know how these foreign cars are. They have to order parts from Germany, and it takes forever." Jasmine nodded slowly, but her eyes didn't believe a word of it. They were filled with a gentle, agonizing pity. Pity. That was the one thing I couldn't stomach. I had spent my entire life working too hard to be pitied. "If you need anything, Ms. Sophia," Jasmine said quietly, "you know you can tell me. You've done so much for me." "I'm fine, baby," I insisted, standing up and smoothing my skirt. "Let's get back to work. We have the fated ledger migration protocols to review before the executive meeting on Tuesday." As I walked away, I felt a deep pang of hypocrisy. I was mentoring this young woman, teaching her how to advocate for herself, how to negotiate her salary, how to stand her ground in meetings full of men who wanted to talk over her. Yet, I was going home every night to a man who treated my possessions and my peace of mind as secondary to his whims. Which brings us back to the freezing boardroom on that Tuesday morning. John had just delivered his smooth, polished lie to the CEO. Sophia actually insisted my sister use it for a while. You know Sophia, heart of gold. He looked at Sarah, awaiting her approving nod. He expected the meeting to move on. He expected me to sit in silence, complicit in my own diminishment, just like I had for 40 years. I looked at Sarah. Her eyebrows were slightly furrowed. She wasn't entirely buying the heart of gold routine. Sarah knew corporate policy better than anyone. Giving a leased corporate liability to an unauthorized, uninsured non-employee wasn't an act of charity. It was a massive, fireable violation of company protocol. I looked at John. He finally met my eyes across the mahogany table. I saw the silent, heavy warning in his gaze. It was the same look he gave me when we were at dinner parties and I started talking about my work too passionately. Don't embarrass me. Don't make a scene. Play your part. And suddenly, sitting in that chair, feeling the ache in my joints and the exhaustion in my bones, the weight of the last 40 years pressed down on my chest with suffocating clarity. I saw 40 years of swallowing my words so he could feel articulate. 40 years of letting him take credit for my financial planning. 40 years of him making decisions without consulting me, telling me I was too emotional or too anxious to handle the big picture. I saw the fated ledger project I had just completed, a project about bringing hidden truths to light, and realized I was living a lie. These were my unspoken scars. They were carved so deep into my psyche that I had forgotten what my own uncompromised voice sounded like. I realized with a terrifying, crystal-clear certainty that if I agreed with him in this room, right now, I would be erasing myself permanently. If I nodded and smiled to protect his ego one more time, there would be nothing left of Sophia White but a hollow shell wearing a tailored suit. "No," I heard myself say. The word dropped into the silent, air-conditioned room like a heavy stone into a glass pond. John's confident smile faltered. The warning in his eyes morphed into genuine panicked shock. His hands twitched on the table. Sophia, honey. No, I said again, my voice growing louder, anchoring itself in my chest. I placed my hands flat on the table to stop them from trembling. I didn't look at John. I looked directly into the eyes of the CEO. We never discussed it, Sarah, I said, my voice ringing with an absolute terrifying clarity. I did not insist. In fact, I never gave permission. My husband took the keys to my designated company vehicle 3 weeks ago and gave them to his sister without my consent. I have been begging for the car back ever since, and he has refused to return it. Someone at the far end of the long table, I think it was the VP of Logistics, inhaled sharply. John's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of gray. He leaned forward, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. Sophia, you are confused. You are misremembering the timeline. We talked about this over breakfast. You are under a lot of stress with the data migration project. I am not confused, John, I said, turning my head slowly to look him dead in the eye. I am 62 years old. I am the director of architecture, and my memory is flawless. You gave away company property without authorization, and you are lying to the chief executive officer to cover it up. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. Sarah held up a hand, silencing John before he could launch into another desperate gaslighting tirade. Her eyes had gone completely cold. She looked at John not as a respected HR director and colleague, but as an immediate, unpredictable liability to her corporation. John, Sarah said, her tone devoid of any warmth. Step out of this room, right now. John stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Sarah, please. This is a private marital misunderstanding. Sophia is just overwhelmed. It stopped being a private marital misunderstanding the second you misappropriated a $70,000 corporate asset, Sarah snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Get out of my boardroom. John's hands were shaking. He looked at the other executives around the table, looking for a lifeline, looking for the old boys club to back him up. But they were all staring at their notepads. He shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom, a look that promised a terrifying retribution when we got home, before turning on his heel and marching out of the room. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind him. The immediate aftermath was a blur of adrenaline and corporate protocol. Sarah adjourned the meeting immediately. She asked me to step into her private office. She was furious, but her anger was directed entirely at John. She immediately picked up her desk phone and called the corporate legal department, followed by the head of fleet management. We are tracking the GPS on that vehicle right now, Sarah told me, pacing the length of her office while holding the phone to her ear. We are sending a recovery team to your sister-in-law's address immediately. Sophia, I am profoundly sorry you were put in this position. No employee should have to endure that kind of manipulation from a colleague, let alone a spouse. I sat in one of her plush leather visitor chairs, my hands wrapped tightly around a cup of hot tea her assistant had silently brought in. I felt entirely numb. The adrenaline was draining out of my system, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread. I had just detonated a bomb in the middle of my 40-year marriage. I had publicly humiliated a man who spent his entire life obsessing over his reputation. I knew there would be hell to pay. I knew the arguments, the guilt trips, and the family phone calls that were waiting for me. But I had no idea that the hell was already burning right beneath my feet, and had been for years. 2 hours later, while I was sitting in my own office trying to focus on my emails, Sarah's assistant knocked on my door. Sarah needs to see you again, she said softly. When I walked back into the CEO's office, Sarah was off the phone, but she looked deeply troubled. They located the car, Sarah said without preamble, motioning for me to sit down. It wasn't parked outside an office building for a job interview, Sophia. I frowned, confusion cutting through my anxiety. Where was it? Sarah pressed a button on her desk console, putting a call on speakerphone. Go ahead, Marcus, she said. The voice of the fleet manager filled the room. Ms. White, we recovered the vehicle from a strip mall parking lot over in Decatur. Your sister-in-law had the keys. She wasn't at an interview. She was using the vehicle to load and transport commercial boxes. Boxes? I repeated, my brow furrowing deeper. What kind of boxes? Dietary supplements, ma'am, the fleet manager said, his voice tense with professional disapproval. We inspected the interior for damages. The trunk and the entire back seat are filled to the brim with Vitality Spark inventory. She's been using the Mercedes as a delivery van. The custom leather in the back is completely ruined, scratched, torn, and stained from the cardboard boxes being shoved in and out. Vitality Spark. The name hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Vitality Spark was a notorious multi-level marketing scheme, a pyramid scheme that sold overpriced, chalky diet shakes and vitamins. Beatrice had gotten heavily involved in it about 6 months ago. She had been constantly harassing our extended relatives on Facebook, begging them to buy her inventory, promising it was her ticket to financial freedom. Just last month, John had told me over dinner that Beatrice had finally given it up. He told me she realized it was a scam and had taken a massive loss, but was moving on to look for traditional corporate work. She didn't give it up, I realized with a sickening, dizzying jolt. She doubled down. And John lied about it. "Thank you, Marcus," Sarah said quietly, terminating the call. She looked at me with deep sympathy. "Sophia, I have to turn this over to internal auditing. John lied about the location and purpose of a company asset to facilitate an outside commercial venture. This is a severe breach of HR ethics." "I understand," I whispered, standing up abruptly. My legs felt like they were made of lead. "Sarah, I need to go to my office. I need to check something." "Take all the time you need." I walked down the hallway to my office. I closed the door, locked it, and pulled the blinds shut. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely type my password into my laptop. If Beatrice was still drowning in that pyramid scheme, and John was not only covering for her but giving her my $70,000 corporate car to make her deliveries, what else was he covering? How deep did the lie go? For our entire marriage, John had handled the large finances. "You handle the groceries, the kids' clothes, and the day-to-day household," he used to say, kissing my cheek with that patronizing smile. "Let me handle the investments. You worry too much. Let the man of the house carry the heavy lifting." For decades, I had trusted him. I deposited my hefty bi-weekly paychecks into our joint account, and he moved the bulk of the money into our shared retirement portfolio and various investment accounts. We were supposed to be comfortable. We were supposed to have nearly $800,000 saved for our golden years, sitting safely in a diversified index fund. I opened a private browsing window. I navigated to our banking portal. I hadn't logged in to look at the master retirement balance in over a year. John always printed out specific, curated summary sheets for me at tax time. I typed in my username and password. The little loading circle spun on the screen. It felt like it was spinning for an eternity. The dashboard loaded. I stared at the screen. I blinked hard, took my reading glasses off, wiped them on my blouse, and put them back on. I stared again. The numbers didn't make sense. They couldn't be right. Joint retirement and savings balance, $42,450. I stopped breathing. The office around me vanished. There was only the harsh blue light of the monitor and those terrible, impossible numbers. Where was the $800,000? Where was 40 years of my labor? With trembling fingers, I clicked on the transaction history tab. I filtered the results by withdrawals over $5,000. Page after page of wire transfers populated the screen. They didn't happen all at once. It was a methodical, systematic draining of our life's work over the last 4 years. $10,000 withdrawn in March, $25,000 wired in July, $40,000 liquidated just 2 months ago. I clicked on the destination details for the most recent wire transfer. Recipient, Beatrice Hanks, Vitality Spark, LLC, operating account. I kept scrolling. The money hadn't just gone to Beatrice. There were dozens of transfers to an external LLC I had never heard of. There were cash withdrawals. There were payments to credit cards I didn't even know we possessed. My husband hadn't just given away my car. He had secretly, methodically drained our entire life savings. The money I had broken my back for. The money meant for our peaceful retirement. The security I had sacrificed so much time with my children to build. He had given half of it away to fund his sister's delusional, failed pyramid scheme. And why? Because he was so desperate to be the savior of his family. Because his ego demanded that he be seen as the wealthy, successful patriarch who could fix everyone's problems with a wave of his checkbook. He had literally sold my future, my security, and my sweat to buy their praise and adoration. I sat back in my desk chair. The corporate office around me felt completely silent, as if the world had stopped spinning on its axis. I wasn't just a disrespected wife. I wasn't just a woman whose boundaries had been ignored. I was a victim of massive, devastating financial theft. And the thief was the man who slept next to me every single night. The man who kissed me on the cheek and told me I worried too much. My cell phone buzzed violently on the desk, shattering the silence. It was a text message from John. "You have humiliated me for the last time, Sophia. You made a fool of me in front of Sarah. When you get home tonight, we are going to have a very long, very serious talk about your attitude and your place in this family. You better be ready to apologize, or there will be consequences." I looked at the text message glowing on the small screen. Then, I looked back at the $42,450 balance on my computer monitor. A strange, unfamiliar sensation washed over me. It started in the tips of my fingers, traveled up my arms, and settled deep into my chest. It was cold. It was absolute. It froze out the fear, the humiliation, and the lifelong, deeply ingrained habit of submission. It froze out the voice of his mother telling me to be a good, compliant wife. It was pure, unadulterated, blinding clarity. I picked up my phone. I didn't reply to his text. I turned the device completely off and dropped it into my purse. "Oh, John," I thought, closing my laptop with a quiet, definitive click. "We are definitely going to have a talk. But I am not going home tonight. I am never going home again." I did not go back to the sprawling 6-bedroom brick house in the suburbs that night. For 40 years, my internal compass had always pointed to John. I had been deeply conditioned by society, by his family, and by my own misplaced sense of duty to rush home whenever there was friction. I was trained to smooth things over, to apologize for making him feel small, to carefully manage his ego so our household could have peace. But as I sat in my corporate office, staring at a retirement balance of $42,450 where $800,000 should have been, that compass shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Instead of driving home to face a man who was preparing to lecture me about my attitude, I booked a room at a modest extended-stay hotel 3 miles from the corporate park. I paid for it using a personal credit card I had opened years ago in my own name, a small rebellion I had kept hidden, just in case. When I unlocked the door to room 312, the space was aggressively ordinary. It smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and stale air conditioning. There was no custom California king bed, no expensive artwork, no granite countertops. But as I set my heavy laptop bag on the small laminate desk and locked the deadbolt, it felt like the safest place on earth. My cell phone had been turned off since the afternoon. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, took a deep breath, and powered it on. The device immediately began vibrating violently in my hand, processing a backlog of notifications. There were 32 missed calls from John. There were 14 from Beatrice. Then came the text messages. Reading them in chronological order was like watching the psychological anatomy of a manipulator laid bare. 4:30 p.m. "Where are you? Dinner is getting cold. Stop acting like a child and come home." 5:15 p.m. "Sophia, this silent treatment is ridiculous. You embarrassed me in front of Sarah today, and I am willing to forgive that, but you need to come home right now so we can discuss how we handle the fallout tomorrow." 6:45 p.m. "My mother is calling. What am I supposed to tell her? That my wife is having a mental breakdown over a leased vehicle? You are embarrassing this family." 8:30 p.m. "Sophia, baby, please pick up the phone. I am worried sick about you. You know how much stress you've been under with the data migration project. Let me take care of you. We can fix whatever is bothering you." 10 p.m. "If you do not walk through this door in the next 20 minutes, do not bother coming back at all." I read the last message twice. Do not bother coming back at all. For 4 decades, the threat of his abandonment had been the invisible leash he used to keep me in line. I had been so terrified of a failed marriage, so terrified of being a statistic, so terrified of proving his mother right when she said I wouldn't be a good wife. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. I didn't shed a single tear. I felt a profound, heavy exhaustion, but beneath it was a steely, quiet resolve. I opened my laptop and spent the next 3 hours compiling every bank statement, every wire transfer receipt, and every financial document I could access from our joint portal. I saved them to a secure encrypted drive. At 8 a.m. the next morning, I did not go to the office. I took a cab to a high-rise building in downtown Atlanta to meet with Robert Davis. Robert was a family law attorney. A female colleague had quietly recommended to me 5 years ago, back when I had first suspected John was hiding credit card debt. I hadn't gone to see him then. I was too afraid. But I was here now, Robert was a silver-haired man in his late 60s. He wasn't one of those loud, aggressive bulldog lawyers you see on television billboards. He was quiet, meticulous, and possessed the calm, clinical demeanor of a trauma surgeon. I sat across from his heavy oak desk and handed him the encrypted flash drive. My husband has systematically drained roughly $750,000 from our joint retirement accounts over the last 4 years, I said, my voice steady, though my hands were clamped tightly together in my lap. He diverted half of it to his sister's failing multi-level marketing business. The other half I cannot trace. He is also currently under corporate investigation for misappropriating my company vehicle to facilitate that same sister's business. Robert didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me how sorry he was. He just took out a legal pad and a fountain pen. "Are you currently residing in the marital home, Sophia?" he asked gently. "No, I checked into a hotel last night. He doesn't know where I am." "Good. Keep it that way," Robert said, writing something down. "Do not go back to the house alone. Do not engage in arguments over text message. From this moment on, you are communicating with a hostile witness. John is going to realize very quickly that his financial crimes are about to be exposed, and men who build their entire identity on the illusion of control become incredibly dangerous when they lose it." "I want my money back, Robert," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "I worked 80-hour weeks for that money. I missed my children's school plays for that money. I want every single cent." Robert nodded slowly. "We are going to initiate a full forensic accounting of his entire financial footprint. We will find where the rest of that money went. But Sophia, you need to prepare yourself. Financial infidelity of this magnitude rarely exists in a vacuum. Usually it is just one symptom of a much deeper rot." I didn't know how prophetic his words would be until I walked into the corporate office 2 days later. The atmosphere on the executive floor was thick, humming with the kind of nervous, whispered energy that only happens when someone powerful falls from grace. As I walked to my office, my assistant, a sweet woman named Maria, looked up with wide eyes. "Miss White," she whispered, standing up quickly, "Sarah needs to see you in her office immediately, and they took John's name off his door." I nodded, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression, and walked to the CEO's suite. Sarah was standing by her window, looking out over the Atlanta traffic. When I entered, she turned around. She looked exhausted, her usual sharp demeanor softened by genuine dismay. "Sophia, please sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair. "I wanted to tell you this personally before the internal memo goes out. John has been placed on indefinite administrative leave. Security escorted him out of the building yesterday evening. He is banned from the premises while the external auditors conduct their review." Hearing that my husband of 40 years had been perp-walked out of the company we had both built our careers in should have broken my heart. Instead, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lift off my lungs. "The audit regarding the corporate vehicle brought something else to light," Sarah continued, sitting behind her desk and folding her hands. "When the IT department locked down John's email and HR servers to preserve evidence, our compliance officers flagged several anomalies. Anomalies that go far beyond a $70,000 Mercedes, Sophia. We are launching a full-scale investigation into his entire tenure as HR director." I felt a cold prickle of dread at the base of my neck. "What kind of anomalies, Sarah?" Sarah sighed deeply. "Systemic bias, manipulated performance reviews. We believe John has been actively, quietly managing out specific demographics of employees for years to protect his own authority." I left Sarah's office feeling like the ground beneath my feet was made of glass. I walked down to the 3rd floor, where the engineering and architecture teams sat. I needed to talk to Jasmine. I found her in her cubicle, staring blankly at a complex CAD model on her screen. When she saw me, she jumped up. "Ms. Sophia, are you okay? Everyone is whispering about Mr. Hanks being escorted out." "I'm fine, Jasmine," I said softly, looking around the open-plan office. "Can we go to a huddle room? I need to ask you something in private." We walked into a small, soundproof glass room, and I shut the door. I looked at this brilliant 28-year-old black woman who had so much potential, so much fire, and I remembered the day I found her crying in the restroom 3 weeks ago. "Jasmine," I said, keeping my voice incredibly gentle, "you know you can tell me the truth. You know I will protect you. Have you been having issues with the Human Resources Department?" Jasmine hesitated. She bit her lower lip, her eyes darting to the glass door as if she was afraid John might suddenly appear. Sophia, I didn't want to burden you. You're his wife, and you've been so good to me. I thought I just wasn't good enough. Good enough for what, baby? A tear spilled over her eyelashes. I applied for the senior architect promotion 3 times in the last 2 years. Every single time my direct manager approved it. He said my work was flawless, but every time it went to HR for final sign-off, it was blocked. My stomach plummeted. Blocked? By who? By Mr. Hanks, Jasmine whispered, wiping her face. He pulled me into his office the last time. He told me that my technical skills were fine, but I wasn't a cultural fit for leadership. He said I had an attitude problem and that I needed to learn how to be more accommodating if I wanted to succeed here. An attitude problem. The oldest, most tired, most insidious dog whistle used against black women in corporate America, and it was being used by a black man against a young woman in his own community. It's not just me, Ms. Sophia, Jasmine continued, her voice trembling. There were 3 other women in the department, women your age, women who looked like us. Over the past 5 years, Mr. Hanks made their lives miserable. He put them on impossible performance improvement plans, denied their bonuses, and told one of them she was too stubborn and set in her ways to learn new systems. He forced them all into early retirement or made them quit. I sat back in the plastic chair, the breath knocked completely out of me. The glass walls of the huddle room felt like they were closing in. This wasn't just corporate politics. This was calculated psychological warfare. For years, I had wondered why I was the only older woman of color in the executive boardroom. I thought I was just the lucky one. I thought I had survived the gauntlet through sheer grit and determination. I used to tell John how lonely it was at the top, how I wished I had peers who understood my specific struggles. And he would hold me, stroke my hair, and say, "You're special, Sophia. You're stronger than them. You don't need anyone else. You have me." The truth was infinitely, horrifyingly darker. John wasn't just holding me back at home. He was systematically eliminating any potential allies at work. He used his immense power as HR director to destroy the careers of women in my demographic to ensure I would never have a support system. He wanted me isolated. He wanted me to believe that I was an anomaly, a fragile exception who only kept her job because he was there to run interference for me. He had built a fortress of isolation around me, brick by brick, firing by firing, so I would never realize my own power. He kept me exhausted, doubting myself, and dependent on his approval. I reached across the table and took Jasmine's hand. My own hands had finally stopped shaking. The shock was gone, replaced by a cold, forging fire. "Jasmine, listen to me," I said, my voice steady and hard. "You are brilliant. You do not have an attitude problem. You have a spine, and weak men are terrified of women with spines. Do not let him dim your light. I am going to fix this." The next month was a blur of legal maneuvering and deafening silence. I stayed in my hotel. John, realizing that his anger wasn't working, shifted his tactics. He realized he was losing his grip on the narrative. The corporate investigation was tightening the noose around his professional life, and Robert's forensic accountants were tearing through his financial history. John needed a trump card, and like all cornered manipulators, he reached for the most vulnerable weapon he had: our children. Michael was 35, a successful corporate attorney living in Charlotte. Chloe was 32, a pediatrician in the Atlanta suburbs. I loved my children fiercely, but I had spent their entire lives shielding them from their father's flaws. I had painted John as the hard-working patriarch, absorbing his emotional absences and financial control so they could have a perfect image of a father. I had done my job too well. As Thanksgiving approached, the phone calls started. "Mom, what are you doing?" Michael asked me on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight with lawyerly disapproval. "Dad says you moved into a hotel over a disagreement about Aunt Beatrice borrowing a car. He says you're trying to ruin his career by spreading rumors to the CEO. You're acting completely irrational." "Michael, it is much more complicated than a car," I tried to explain, sitting on my hotel bed. "He's devastated, Mom. He's a 65-year-old man who just got escorted out of his office because of a misunderstanding. You need to come home and talk to him. You're throwing away our family legacy over pride." 2 days later, Chloe called, crying. "Mom, please, this is embarrassing. Dad is a wreck. He says you're going through a late-life crisis. He loves you so much. We're all supposed to be at the house for Thanksgiving next week. Please, just come home and drop the divorce. We can all go to family therapy. John was feeding them a masterful narrative. I was the erratic, emotionally unstable, vindictive woman throwing away a 40-year marriage over a trivial inconvenience. He was the patient, wounded husband waiting for his wife to come to her senses. He knew that the societal expectation for a mother is to sacrifice everything, including her own safety and sanity, to keep the family unit intact. He was banking on my maternal guilt to drag me back into the cage. He sent me a text message 3 days before Thanksgiving. The kids are heartbroken, Sophia. They are coming to the house for Thanksgiving dinner. I have ordered the turkey from the caterer. Come home. Let's heal this family. I am ready to forgive you. I am ready to forgive you. The audacity of those words burned in my chest. I called Robert. I'm going to the house for Thanksgiving dinner, I told my lawyer. Robert paused. Sophia, I strongly advise against that. It is an emotional ambush. I know it is, I said, zipping up my boots. But I have spent 40 years protecting my children from the truth so they could have a hero. It's time they met the man they're defending. Thanksgiving Day was unseasonably cold for Atlanta. I pulled my rental car into the driveway of the massive brick house I had helped pay for but no longer recognized as home. When I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon hit me. It smelled like every Thanksgiving for the past 4 decades. The holidays I had orchestrated, the meals I had cooked while my feet ached, the traditions I had upheld while John sat in the living room drinking scotch and taking the credit. I walked into the formal dining room. The table was impeccably set with my good china, the crystal stemware I had bought in Paris, and a massive centerpiece. John sat at the head of the table. He was wearing a soft cashmere sweater, looking every bit the distinguished, weary patriarch. Michael and Chloe sat on either side of him, and sitting at the far end of the table, sipping a glass of my expensive Chardonnay, was Beatrice. The silence when I walked into the room was heavy, suffocating. "Mom?" Chloe said softly, half standing. She looked relieved, but incredibly anxious. "Sit down, Chloe," John said gently, holding up a hand. He looked at me, a smug, untouchable smirk playing at the very corners of his mouth. He thought he had won. He thought the combined weight of his presence, the children's disappointment, and the holiday tradition had finally broken my resolve. "Sophia," John said, his voice dripping with magnanimous patience, "I am so glad you decided to come to your senses. We have all been very worried about you. Take off your coat. Sit down. Let's say grace and put this unfortunate chapter behind us." I did not take off my wool coat. I did not sit down. I stood at the end of the long mahogany table, my hands resting lightly on the back of an empty chair. I looked at the beautiful house, the expensive china, the children I had raised, and the man who had hollowed me out for 40 years. "I am not staying for dinner, John," I said, my voice calm, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. Michael sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. "Mom, please, don't do this. Dad told us everything. You're putting him through a corporate investigation. You're threatening divorce. Over a car? You're tearing our legacy apart. It's humiliating." "A legacy," I repeated quietly, tasting the word. I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, bound legal folder. It was the preliminary report from Robert's forensic accountants, complete with bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and the HR audit summaries Sarah had legally released to my attorney. I tossed the heavy folder onto the center of the dining table. It hit the polished mahogany with a loud, sharp smack that made Beatrice jump, spilling a few drops of wine onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Let's talk about your father's legacy," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden, terrified silence of the room. I looked directly at my son, the corporate attorney. "Open the folder, Michael. Turn to page 4. Do it." Michael hesitated, looking at John. John's face had suddenly lost all of its color. "Sophia, stop this immediately," John ordered, his voice cracking. "Do not drag the children into your paranoid delusions." "Open it, Michael," I commanded, using the voice I used to command boardrooms full of executives. Michael reached out and opened the folder. He flipped to the 4th page. His eyes scanned the document. I watched his legal mind process the numbers, the dates, the account routing information. The annoyance on his face melted away, replaced by a profound, sickening horror. "That is the master statement for our joint retirement account," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. And beneath it are the wire transfer receipts showing your father methodically liquidating nearly $800,000 of my life savings over the last 4 years. He funneled nearly half of it to your Aunt Beatrice to fund her illegal pyramid scheme. Beatrice choked, her hand flying to her mouth. Michael stared at the paper, his mouth slightly open, unable to speak. I looked at my daughter. Turn to page 12, Chloe. Chloe's hands were shaking as she reached over and flipped the pages. Those are the HR audit reports from our corporate compliance office, I continued, unyielding. They detail how your father spent the last 5 years using his position as HR director to systematically block the promotions of, and ultimately terminate, 4 older black women in my department. He destroyed the careers of innocent women to ensure I would be completely isolated at work, entirely dependent on him for protection. John stood up, his chair tipping backward and crashing to the hardwood floor. He was panicking. The carefully constructed mask was disintegrating right in front of his children. "These are lies!" John shouted, his voice shrill, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She forged these. She's trying to destroy me because she's a bitter, materialistic woman. Kids, don't look at that." "Sit down, John," I roared, the sheer force of my voice, a voice that had been suppressed, policed, and silenced since 1986, reverberated off the walls. It was the roar of 40 years of suffocated breath finally escaping. It carried so much power, so much undeniable truth, that John actually took a physical step backward, his chest heaving. I looked back at my children. They were staring at the documents, tears welling in Chloe's eyes. The illusion of their perfect provider father was crumbling into dust before their very eyes. They were finally seeing the termite damage in the foundation. "For 40 years, I said, my voice dropping back to a quiet, devastating murmur, I was the foundation of this house. I swallowed every insult from your family, Beatrice. I took the back seat so John could drive. I let him play the king. I let him manage the money because he told me I wasn't smart enough to handle the big picture. And while I was building this family, while I was raising you two, he was financially, professionally, and psychologically bleeding me to death." I looked at John one last time. The smugness was completely gone. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly terrified. The man who had controlled my every move for 4 decades suddenly looked like a stranger I wouldn't even trust with $1. "I am not an angry, erratic woman having a late-life crisis," I said, buttoning my wool coat. "I am a woman who finally woke up. I will see you in court, John. And Michael, Chloe, I love you both, but I am done setting myself on fire to keep this family warm." I turned on my heel and walked out the front door. The cool November air hit my face as I walked down the driveway to my rental car. Behind me, I could hear the muffled sounds of shouting erupting inside the dining room, Chloe crying, Michael yelling at his father, the house of cards finally collapsing under the weight of the truth. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the life I had known for 40 years. I was 62 years old. I was staying in a cheap hotel. My retirement was gone, my marriage was over, and the road ahead was going to be a brutal, grueling legal war. But as I merged onto the highway, watching the Atlanta skyline rise in the distance against the autumn sunset, I took a deep breath. For the first time in my entire adult life, the air belonged entirely to me. Divorce, when you are 62 years old and disentangling 4 decades of a shared life, is not a dramatic cinematic event. It is a grueling, exhausting war of attrition. It is fought not with screaming matches in the rain, but with endless stacks of manila folders, billable hours, and the slow, agonizing dissection of every choice you have ever made. The months following that explosive Thanksgiving dinner were some of the darkest of my life. I moved out of the extended stay hotel and signed a lease on a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet older neighborhood in Atlanta. It had good light and hardwood floors, but for the first few weeks, it felt like a cavern. I spent the holidays alone, eating takeout on a folding chair, ignoring the frantic, confused text messages from my children, who were now dealing with the shattered fragments of their father's image. John, true to his nature, did not surrender. A narcissist stripped of his mask doesn't repent. He retaliates. By January, John had hired a notoriously aggressive defense attorney whose entire strategy relied on weaponizing my race, my age, and my ambition against me. I read their preliminary filings sitting at my small kitchen table, my hands trembling with a mixture of rage and profound disgust. They were trying to paint a picture of me that fit the oldest, ugliest stereotype in the corporate world, the angry black woman. Their legal documents claimed I was an overly emotional, hostile, and domineering spouse who was going through a late-life crisis. They argued that John, the devoted, patient patriarch, had only moved funds around to protect our assets from my erratic spending habits and declining cognitive stability. They framed his embezzlement as misguided but well-intentioned family management. He even had his sister Beatrice submit an affidavit claiming I had always been jealous of her relationship with John and was using my corporate power to punish his family. It was a smear campaign designed to break my spirit. They wanted the judge to look at me and see someone bitter and unhinged, rather than a brilliant, calculated professional who had been systematically robbed. They wanted me to get angry, to lash out, to prove their point. "Let them talk, Sophia," my lawyer Robert told me one rainy Tuesday afternoon as we sat in his high-rise office overlooking the gray city. Robert never raised his voice, but his eyes missed nothing. "Let them dig their own grave with their arrogance, because while they are busy writing fiction and relying on lazy stereotypes, my forensic accountants have been reading your husband's bank statements line by line. And Sophia, we found something else." The air in Robert's office suddenly felt very heavy. The steady patter of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to amplify in the silence. "We knew about the $400,000 he drained for Beatrice's pyramid scheme," Robert said softly, folding his hands over a thick red legal folder. "But that left another $350,000 unaccounted for. Money that vanished through a slow, steady drip out of your joint checking accounts, dating back nearly 3 decades. Cash withdrawals, untraceable money orders, and eventually, a hidden LLC. My brow furrowed. I leaned forward, the leather of the chair creaking beneath me. 3 decades? Robert, what are you talking about? 30 years ago, we were barely making ends meet. Michael was a toddler. Chloe was just born. I was working night shifts to pay for my engineering degree. "I know," Robert said, his voice laced with profound, quiet sympathy. He opened the red folder. "Sophia, do you know a young man at your company named Tyler? Tyler Vance?" I blinked, completely caught off guard by the name. "Yes, Tyler is John's nephew from his mother's side of the family. He's 29 or 30. He joined our company a few years ago in the mailroom, but John heavily advocated for him. Tyler is the head of regional sales now." "Why are we talking about Tyler?" Robert didn't blink. He just stared at me, the clinical detachment of a lawyer giving way to the gentle sorrow of a human being delivering fatal news. "Sophia," Robert said softly, "Tyler is not John's nephew." The room stopped. My heart gave a strange, violent flutter against my ribs, and then seemed to stop beating entirely. Robert pulled a series of documents from the folder and laid them out on the heavy oak desk. A birth certificate, a property deed, a DNA registry document subpoenaed from a commercial genealogy site. 30 years ago, Robert explained, his voice anchoring me to the room as the edges of my vision began to blur. "John had an affair with a woman named Elise Vance. When she got pregnant, John didn't leave you. Instead, he bought her a small townhouse in Marietta through a proxy LLC. He has been paying her mortgage, her utilities, and eventually Tyler's private school tuition, using the bonuses you earned from your promotions." I stared at the paperwork. The names Elise Vance and John Hanks printed in stark black ink. "When Tyler graduated," Robert continued, "John used his power as HR director to get his illegitimate son a job at your company, shielding him under the guise of being a nephew. He then manipulated the corporate ladder, bypassing qualified candidates, to fast-track Tyler's promotion to head of sales." I couldn't breathe. The air conditioning in the room felt like ice against my skin. Tyler wasn't his nephew. He was his son. For 30 years, my husband had been living a double life. Every time I worked a weekend to finish a project, every time I skipped a family vacation because we couldn't afford it, every time I deposited my hard-earned salary into our joint account, I was literally feeding, housing, and raising his illegitimate child and his mistress. John hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my reality. He had looked me in the eye every single night for 30 years, kissed my forehead, and thanked God for our beautiful marriage, while using my sweat, my tears, and my exhaustion to fund a secret family across town. I thought about the times John had brought Tyler to our house for summer barbecues. I had cooked for that boy. I had asked him about his college classes. I had smiled as John patted the boy on the back, telling me how important it was to mentor the youth in our family. The betrayal was so vast, so deep, and so intricately woven into the fabric of my entire adult life that I couldn't even process it as anger. It was a searing, white-hot, agonizing clarity. I put my hands over my face. I didn't cry. The pain was too absolute for tears. "Robert," I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to a ghost. "I'm here, Sophia." I lowered my hands. I looked at the lawyer and I felt 40 years of compliance, of submission, of making myself small, burn away into ash. "I want to destroy him," I said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a collapsing star. "I don't want to settle. I don't want mediation. I want this in a courtroom. I want every single lie dragged into the light. I want nothing left of him but the ashes of his ego." Robert smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the cold, predatory glint of a shark smelling blood in the water. "I will clear my calendar, Sophia. We are going to war." The final divorce hearing took place in late February. Because of the sheer volume of financial fraud, embezzlement, and corporate entanglement, the judge had denied John's desperate motions for private mediation. We were in a county courthouse. The room was small, paneled in cheap scuffed wood, and smelled of floor wax and old paper. It was aggressively mundane for a room where lives were dismantled. John sat at the defense table with his expensive, aggressive lawyer. John had orchestrated his appearance perfectly. He was wearing a slightly oversized older gray suit to look diminished and financially strained. He slumped his shoulders, casting his eyes downward, playing the role of the broken, wrongly accused older gentleman. When it was his turn to take the stand, John gave the performance of a lifetime. He wept. Actual, real tears rolled down his cheeks as his lawyer guided him through a rehearsed narrative. He told the judge how much he loved me. He talked about how he had sacrificed his own ambitions to support my demanding career. He painted a picture of me as a woman who had been corrupted by corporate power, whose unfortunate paranoia and aggressive disposition had destroyed our golden years. "I just wanted to help my family, Your Honor," John choked out, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief. "My sister was struggling. I made a mistake with the car, yes. I admit that. But my wife, she became obsessed with control. She changed. She threw away a beautiful 40-year marriage over a leased Mercedes." The judge, an older, no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled into a tight bun, took notes. Her expression gave absolutely nothing away. Then it was Robert's turn to cross-examine. Robert walked up to the podium, casually adjusting his glasses. He didn't yell. He didn't badger. He spoke with the quiet, deadly precision of a sniper. "Mr. Hanks," Robert began, resting his hands on the podium, "you claim your wife was obsessed with money and control. Is that correct?" "Yes." John sighed heavily, looking at the judge for sympathy. "It consumed her." "I see." Robert picked up a piece of paper. "And was it her obsession with money that caused you to drain nearly $400,000 of her retirement savings to fund a multi-level marketing scheme that was legally registered under your sister's name, but for which you were a silent financial partner?" John's fake tears stopped instantly. His jaw tightened. "I was investing for our future. I was trying to build generational wealth. Sophia didn't understand business. You were investing in chalky diet shakes, Mr. Hanks, and you hid the losses." Robert didn't even look up. He just picked up another piece of paper. "Let's talk about your other investments. Let's talk about generational wealth. Let's talk about the townhouse in Marietta." I watched John's face from my seat at the plaintiff's table. The color drained from his skin so fast he looked like a corpse. His eyes darted to his lawyer, panic suddenly radiating from every pore of his body. His lawyer looked confused, furiously flipping through his own notes. "For 30 years, Robert's voice boomed through the small courtroom, shattering the quiet. "You siphoned over $350,000 in marital assets to a woman named Elise Vance, and you used your position as Human Resources Director to illegally fast-track your illegitimate son, Tyler Vance, to a 6-figure corporate position, shielding him under the guise of being your nephew." The courtroom fell deathly silent. The court reporter's fingers hovered frozen over her stenography machine. Even John's expensive lawyer looked shocked, staring at the DNA documents and LLC property deeds Robert slapped onto the evidence table. "Is it true, Mr. Hanks?" Robert demanded, his voice finally rising, echoing off the wooden panels. Did you use Sophia White's paycheck, her bonuses, and her retirement to finance your mistress and your secret child for 3 decades while telling your wife you couldn't afford to take her on vacation? The mask cracked. The carefully constructed, polite, patriarchal manipulation that John had worn like a second skin for 40 years shattered into a million jagged pieces. He realized in that exact moment that he had lost completely. He was exposed. There was no charm, no lie, no gaslighting that could save him from the paper trail. And when a narcissist realizes they can no longer control the narrative, they do not apologize. They attack. "She owed me!" John suddenly screamed. He gripped the edges of the witness stand, his face turning a violent, alarming shade of purple. He half stood, his voice echoing with pure, unhinged, terrifying venom. "I made her!" John roared, pointing a shaking finger at me across the room. "She was nothing but a typist with an associate degree when I found her. I told her how to dress. I told her how to speak to the white executives. I protected her. She worked 80 hours a week. She was never home. I was the one left in that house. I deserved a real family. I deserved that money for putting up with her ambition. She is a cold, selfish woman, and she thinks she's so smart, but she's nothing without me." He kept screaming, spewing decades of deep-seated insecurity and misogyny. The bailiff had to step forward, placing a hand on his weapon. John's own lawyer buried his face in his hands, realizing his client had just torpedoed his own case in front of a judge. I didn't flinch. I just sat there, my hands neatly folded in my lap, looking at the man I had feared and catered to for my entire adult life. He wasn't a giant. He wasn't a protector. He wasn't the brilliant patriarch his mother claimed he was. He was a small, pathetic, terrified little man who had relied entirely on my brilliance, my money, and my silence to survive. The judge banged her gavel so hard it sounded like a gunshot. Her face was twisted in absolute disgust. "Mr. Hanks, sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed in handcuffs and held in contempt of court," she barked. John collapsed back into the witness chair, panting, glaring at me with a hatred so pure it practically vibrated in the air. The judge looked down at him from her bench, her eyes filled with cold judicial fury. In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a display of such calculated, parasitic financial and emotional abuse. You have weaponized your marriage, your corporate position, and your own family. You are a fraud, sir. The ruling was a bloodbath. Because Georgia is an equitable distribution state, and because John had committed egregious financial fraud and dissipation of marital assets, the judge did not split things 50-50. She awarded me 100% of the remaining marital assets. She ordered the immediate sale of John's precious 6-bedroom suburban house to repay the retirement funds he stole. She stripped him of his portion of the remaining pensions. She even ordered him to pay my exorbitant legal fees. John Hanks walked out of that courtroom with the clothes on his back and a mountain of legal and tax debt. He was 65 years old, publicly disgraced, utterly broke, and entirely alone. I spent the next month breathing, just breathing. I settled into my apartment. I bought a comfortable deep blue velvet couch that John would have hated. I slept for 8 uninterrupted hours a night. And a strange thing happened. The chronic pain in my lower back and knees miraculously vanished. It turns out, you carry a massive amount of physical pain when you spend 40 years making yourself small to accommodate someone else's ego. In early April, the air in Atlanta turning warm and sweet with dogwood blossoms, my cell phone rang. It was Sarah, the CEO of my company. "Sophia," Sarah said warmly, her voice a welcome contrast to the cold legal proceedings of the past few months. "Are you ready to come back to the building?" I put on my sharpest crimson blazer, applied a bold red lipstick I hadn't worn since I was in my 30s, and drove my own car to the corporate headquarters. When I walked into the lobby, the security guard smiled at me. I took the elevator up to the executive floor, fully expecting to return to my old office as Director of Architecture and resume the Faded Ledger project. Instead, Sarah's assistant ushered me straight into the mahogany boardroom. It was the exact same room where my life had exploded 6 months prior. But this time, John wasn't sitting across from me. Sarah was waiting for me, along with the chairman of the board of directors. "Sophia, please sit," Sarah said, gesturing to the chair at the right hand of the head table. I sat down, my heart beating steadily. I realized, looking around the expansive, glass-walled room, that I wasn't afraid of these spaces anymore. The external investigation into John Hanks and the HR department concluded last week, Sarah began, her tone deeply serious, treating me not just as an employee, but as an equal. What the auditors found was a systemic, catastrophic failure of ethics. John didn't just defraud the company with the company car, he actively suppressed diverse talent. He blocked promotions, drove out senior women of color, and created a culture of fear to protect his own ego and hide his nepotism with Tyler Vance. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with immense respect and a touch of corporate regret. This company failed you, Sophia. We were blind to the rot in our own foundation because John was so good at managing up. We have terminated the entire senior HR leadership team who was complicit in John's schemes. Tyler Vance has been dismissed, but now we have to rebuild. The chairman of the board leaned forward. We need someone with unimpeachable integrity, Sophia. Someone who understands the architecture of this business from the ground up, who knows where the data is buried, and someone who knows exactly what it feels like to be silenced. We need someone who isn't afraid to speak the truth in a room full of cowards. Sarah slid a heavy, embossed leather folder across the table toward me. The board has voted unanimously, Sarah said with a genuine smile. We want you to step in as our new chief operating officer. It comes with a C-level equity package, a significant salary increase, and the absolute authority to completely restructure this company's culture and operations. I looked down at the contract. The compensation numbers printed on the page were staggering, but it wasn't the money that made my throat tighten. It was the absolute poetic vindication. John had spent his entire life trying to keep me beneath him. He had manipulated the system, destroyed other women's careers, and stolen my money to ensure I never reached the top of the mountain, terrified that if I did, I would realize I didn't need him. And by trying to destroy me, he had accidentally cleared the path for my ultimate ascension. I looked up from the folder. I didn't cry. I didn't minimize my worth by saying I was humbled or didn't deserve it. I had earned this 10 times over. I picked up the heavy silver pen resting next to the folder. I accept, I said, looking Sarah directly in the eye. But I have one immediate operational directive. Name it, Sarah said. Jasmine, the junior architect in my former department. I want her promoted to senior architect immediately, with retroactive back pay for the 3 years John blocked her advancement. She reports directly to me. Sarah smiled broadly, nodding at the chairman. Done. I signed my name at the bottom of the contract. Not the forged, looped letters John used to steal from me. My real, sharp, undeniable signature. Sophia White, COO. It has been 2 years since that day in the boardroom. I am 64 years old now. Most people my age are talking about winding down, but I feel like my life has just truly begun. I spent the last 2 years rebuilding the company's infrastructure, clearing out the toxic management, and mentoring a whole new generation of brilliant young women who will never have to shrink themselves to fit into this building. Jasmine is thriving. She leads her own engineering team now, and watching her command a room with absolute confidence heals a part of my soul I didn't know was broken. I heard through my children that John's life unraveled completely. Without my 6-figure salary to support them, Elise Vance sold the townhouse and moved out of state. Tyler, furious that his corporate fast track was derailed by his father's lies, refuses to speak to him. John now lives in a tiny rented studio apartment on the outskirts of the city, working part-time as a low-level recruiter for a temp agency. Michael and Chloe eventually forgave him enough to speak to him on holidays, but the reverence they once had for their father is gone forever. He is a king without a kingdom, spending his days telling anyone who will listen about how he used to be a big shot. Sometimes, when the corporate office is quiet in the late afternoon, I stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. The sun catches the glass of the skyscrapers, turning the city into a sea of gold. My own car, a sleek, sensible, but entirely mine sedan, is parked safely in the VIP executive spot downstairs. I lost 40 years, a house I loved, and an illusion of a perfect family. I had to reconstruct my reality from the ground up at an age when most people are settling into their twilight. But if there is any woman listening to this story right now who feels invisible, if you are 50, 60, or 70 years old, and you think your time has passed, or that it's too late to start over, listen to me carefully. Your sacrifices were real, and they were beautiful, but they do not have to be your prison. You do not have to swallow your voice to keep the peace in a house that does not respect you. You do not owe your sanity to a man who uses your light to hide his own darkness. It is terrifying to dismantle a life you spent decades building. It is exhausting to face the truth. But the peace you find on the other side of that truth is worth every single tear. The moment you stop making yourself small to comfort a weak man, you will be amazed at how quickly you can touch the sky. I lost my past, but for the first time in my life, I own my future. And let me tell you, the view from the top is absolutely beautiful.